over the dark night. She reached up to the sky of stars and caught the red-hot light of the North Star.
Greetings and welcome back as always. The leaders of Russia, China, India, and 7 other nations met Monday in northern China for the latest annual summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The SCO ran in Tianjin, China from Sunday, August 31st through yesterday, September 1st. Quote, "We must continue to make a clear stand against hegemonism and power politics and practice true multilateralism," Chinese President Xi Jinping said at the conference. That makes sense to me. What are the signals that we should pay attention to coming out of this summit? Let's connect some dots and find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. With each show, my guests and I provide insight and analysis into current events and the broader historical context in which most of these events take place. I want to quickly touch on 2 headlines for today. So, as the Western narrative regarding Ukraine is that Putin is obstinate, unwilling to agree to a ceasefire, and continues to change his demands, none of which is really that accurate, Antiwar.com reports NATO commander urges more arms makers to test their weapons in Ukraine. A Ukrainian tech firm has received dozens of applications from foreign contractors to test new weapons in Ukraine, and Alexis Grinkowicz, a U.S. Air Force general who serves as NATO's supreme allied commander in Europe, is urging more weapons makers to test their military equipment on the battlefield in Ukraine as the war continues to rage. Quote, "Those few that have tried it have either learned a lot or they've decided to go home because they can't compete in that environment. But that's going to be the environment we face," Grinkowicz said last week while speaking virtually to an industry group in Washington. Folks, this sounds like escalation and not de-escalation to me. These kinds of indicators might be some of the reasons why President Putin is taking the position that he's taking. And Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro says if the U.S. attacks, he will declare the country a, quote, republic in arms, end quote. The U.S. has deployed multiple warships toward Venezuela's coast and appears to be preparing for a regime change effort. Venezuelan President Maduro held a press conference yesterday where he addressed the deployment of warships off Venezuela's coast and warned that if the U.S. attacked, he would declare his country a republic in arms and engage in armed struggle. The Trump administration claims that Maduro is the leader of the Cartel of the Suns, a term that is used to describe a network of Venezuelan government and military officials allegedly involved, and I underscore allegedly, in drug trafficking, but it does not actually exist as an organization. Maduro and other Latin leaders, including Colombian President Gustavo Petro, have denied the U.S. claims, and to my knowledge, the United States has not presented any evidence to support the claim. On today's episode, the issue before us is, as I said at the top, they just wrapped up the 2025 Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in the northern port city of Tianjin, China. It is hailed as China's biggest diplomatic event of the year, drawing political heavyweights, including Russian President Vladimir Putin, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. What are we to make of all of this? Well, my guest, let's talk to her. She's an author, professor at the Department of Political Studies at the University of Manitoba, Canada, director of the Geopolitical Economic Research Group, Dr. Radhika Desai. As always, welcome back.
As always, great to be here, Wilma.
The Western media story or narrative is that this is a China anti-U.S. gathering, and another outlet even says, while China continues to exert influence in the region, how well is all of this being received? That's another question. This strikes me as, why is it, and this is a rhetorical question, being pro-me is interpreted or defined as being anti-you? Why can't China be pro-China without the narrative being it's anti-US?
You know, this is really a very, very good place to start, because this is exactly the issue. The West is basically in the process, in the desperate attempt to try to preserve what remains of its relative power in the world. And as you know, its relative power is declining along a number of fronts. The West has increasingly taken this, if you are, and it goes back to George Bush Jr., if you are not with us, you are against us, etc., back to 9/11 and all that. And rather the war against Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on and so forth. Whereas precisely the new world order that President Xi very explicitly called for in his speech, and which the Tianjin SCO declaration also calls for, is precisely a world order in which every country has the right to look after itself, the right to essentially engage in those relations with the rest of the world which are of benefit to itself, and naturally of mutual benefit with its partners. And this is the kind of world they wish to create, whereas the West has essentially tried to impose a world order on the rest of the world in which you do things our way. And of course, our way is full of double standards, but you basically do what we ask you to do, which is open up your economies to serve our needs, and only then we will call you our friends, we will call you democratic, etc., etc. So this is exactly the nub of the matter. Is the West wants to essentially create this aggressive front. And by the way, you in your opening remarks, you mentioned the impending, the continuing war in Ukraine, which is, as you say, being misused to test various new weapon systems. You mentioned the new military aggression against Venezuela that the US is undertaking, but you forgot to mention a third thing, which is that Iran, the European Union has just opened, has basically said that it's going to reimpose sanctions on Iran, even though the United States is not doing that. And the European Union is sort of very taking this forward position, which, according to many commentators, is likely to bring war closer. And indeed, I was listening to the invaluable Professor Mohammad Marandi, who pointed out that precisely that Iran has to ready itself for war. It is readying itself for war because the possibility of another war against Iran can no longer be discounted. So you have this warlike front that the West is creating. And this peaceable group of countries that have gathered, I would say.
Now, let me let you take a second and clear your throat. And while you're doing that, one of the things that really struck me, as I was been reading the readouts of this, President Xi says, quote, "We must continue to take a clear stand against hegemonism and power politics and practice true multilateralism." And this is being described as a thinly veiled swipe at the United States and Trump's tariff policies, to which I ask, well, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with multilateralism? Hegemonism, I don't think, has really boded well for hardly anybody except the hegemon. So it's been, again, it's presented as though she is taking these veiled swipes at the United States. What that I think doesn't account for is the language of diplomacy and how diplomats convey messages. Dr. Desai.
Yeah, so exactly the hegemonism against which China has spoken out many times. I mean, especially over the last few years, and especially over the last couple of years since the opening of the special military operation in Ukraine. I think that countries around the world have become more and more aware of the duplicity, the double standards of the so-called rules-based international order, and so on, which is, we make the rules, you obey the rules, etc. And I think there's another very important thing that comes out very clearly in the declaration from Tianjin and in President Xi's speech, which is that basically at the crux of this order is, as they keep pointing out, is respect for the UN Charter, and in particular, respect for sovereignty, which then goes with non-interference in internal affairs of other countries, non-aggression, cooperation for mutual benefit, etc. And at the core of this sovereignty is economic sovereignty, the right to organize your economy in the way, the right of every country to organize its economy in the way that its leaders deem is best for that country. And I think that this, and as you know, as I was saying earlier, the West has always opposed this because, behind all this discussion about security and all that is ultimately an economic motive, which is essentially to subjugate, to subordinate the rest of the world in such a way that the Western countries like the United States and so on can take advantage of these countries, of their cheap labor, their cheap commodities, and of course to treat them as markets if possible, although given how much they impoverish these countries, very few of them can be treated as viable markets. But anyway, the point is that it has been to subjugate them economically, and it is precisely this economic sovereignty that this grouping, the SCO, and to some, the BRICS, and in general the world majority, if we may call them that, has been trying to take back. And I think as the US has less and less to offer, as the US, Europe, and Japan, for that matter, have less and less to offer, there is more and more of an opening for this new vision to realize itself. And maybe I'll just add one other thing before I close here, before I close this set of points. In recent years, the United Nations has come in for a great deal of criticism, and it is true that it is a shame that we have created this elaborate structure of international governance, and still it cannot be used to stop the genocide in Gaza. And also, as we have now increasingly hearing, there is a further famine, starvation, war-provoked famine, starvation, etc., are taking place in Sudan. So in all of these conflicts, the UN has been hobbled. And the reason for that, of course, is the fact that the United States is always willing to exercise its veto, particularly vis-a-vis Israel. And so these wars continue. But still, this new grouping sticks by the United Nations Charter. Why? Because the particular manner in which what I call the 30 years crisis of 1914 to 1945, which contained two imperialist world wars and a Great Depression, the manner in which this was resolved had a lot to do with the role that the Soviet Union and communist forces in China played in it. And this is the thing that the Chinese want to foreground, of course, this year, given that it's the 80th anniversary of the defeat of the victory over Japan, and so on. And why is this relevant to the United Nations? It's because of their role, of the role of the Soviet Union and of China, that the Russia and China today hold seats, two of the permanent seats in the United Nations Security Council, and they have always used them for progressive purposes, whereas Western countries have used them for the opposite sort of purposes. And of course, the Soviet, they have, these two entities have changed a great deal. In the early years, the United States essentially gave the seat, China's seat in the United Nations, to the nationalist forces. And even today, in the context of China's, celebration of 80 years and the role of communist forces in the victory over Japan, the West still continues to insist that the nationalist forces had played a bigger role. This is simply not true. It was the nationalist forces that were in the forefront of the defeat of Japan. And it was thankfully, thanks to the power of the Soviet Union and the power of the joint, the alliance between the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, that the United States then acted to drive a wedge between the two, namely the PRC and China, back in the 1970s, with Nixon going to China, blah, blah, etc. And they did tragically drive a wedge between these two countries for a while. But now these two entities are coming together once again in a new, much faster alliance than was possible back then.
I'm very glad that you made the point that you just made, because what we're looking at is a lot of former colonial subjects that were granted flag independence through revolutions in the 60s and the 70s, particularly countries on the African continent, former colonial subjects, then had to deal with neocolonialism as they were granted flag independence, but they were never given control over their economies. And now the struggle that we see in Kenya, in Burkina Faso, in Niger, they are now saying, we want to control our resources because we are mineral rich and economically still poor. And that, to your point, is what's causing a lot of these loggerheads. And China is offering, as well as Russia through BRICS and China through the SCO, they're offering another alternative. In fact, there was a piece just today in the Financial Times. Developing countries swap out dollar debt to cut borrowing costs. Developing countries are moving out of dollar debt and turning to currencies with rock bottom interest rates, such as the Chinese renminbi and the Swiss franc. So that's just one little data point to add to the point that you were just making.
Yeah, and I mean, in a certain sense, I totally see what you mean when you refer to flag independence and so on. Having said that, I see this as a kind of a long, drawn out process. I mean, even flag independence did mean something. It didn't mean what everybody would have, everything that people would have wished it to mean, but it did mean something. So in a certain
Yes.
sense, we're looking at a very long process, long drawn out process of effective decolonization. So, and this process is composed of at least two different aspects. One is, of course, the fact that historically, the communist countries, the Soviet Union in its time, China today, have been able to build. Apart from countries like Taiwan and South Korea, which benefited from being the front line against communism in an inordinate way, getting enormous amounts of US aid and so on and so forth, there have hardly been any country, there has been no country in the world, indeed, that has been able to furnish its citizens with a standard, no country outside the capitalist core, the West plus Japan, that has been able to furnish its citizens with a standard of living that is some reasonable facsimile of Western standards of living. And those countries have historically been the Soviet Union and the other communist countries, and now China, which is, still approaching that, but we can assume that they will achieve something like that. And I think that really shows us that that you really need, in order to take back your economic sovereignty, a much greater effort is necessary than merely formal independence. You need essentially the idea that you can leave your economy to the market is only a recipe for subordination to Western capitalist countries and Japan. So you really have to have the social capacity to plan your economy and to also take the pain that will necessarily be inflicted on your country when the West reacts to your planning your economy, because they will, in the moment, it's so funny, every time I've used, like right now with this Tianjin summit, the Western press is overflowing with stories about how all the autocrats have gathered in Tianjin. But what does the West mean by an autocrat? For the West, an autocrat is precisely that sort of person, that sort of leader who wishes to infringe on the freedom of capital. They can do whatever else they like, but the moment they infringe on the freedom of capital, they become autocrats. And of course, that's precisely what the West doesn't want, because the West wants its capitalists to go to these countries and do whatever they like, and be free to do whatever they like. So any infringement on the rights of these people makes these guys autocrats. But here's the crunch. Without infringing on the rights of capital, no country can develop today. No country has been able to develop in this fashion since 1914, because the only other way of developing is by acquiring a subjugated hinterland, which the countries that developed before that date, so all the Western countries and Japan, they could do that. But the rest of the world has to develop without imposing economic subordination on any other territory. And in order to do that, you've got to be able to control your economy much more heavily than was done, to control capital much more heavily than was done historically in Western countries up to 1914.
You also mentioned this discussion about World War II, and there's a piece in today's Washington Post on World War II anniversary. China seeks to erase U.S. role in victory. As it celebrates the 80th anniversary of Japanese surrender, China is trying to recast wartime history by downplaying U.S. help while emphasizing Moscow's role. Well, two things. One, the headline says erase U.S. role, and right after that, downplay while emphasizing Moscow's role. Once again, being pro-me is an anti-you. Anybody that understands the real dynamics of World War II understands the U.S. could not have won in Europe without the sacrifices of Russia. You could just look at the numbers lost. and what, 2.1 million to 400,000, something like that. So this is a rebalancing of the narrative. It's not anything other than trying to present the truth in a better, different light.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, first of all, as you say, the Chinese are not trying to erase the American role. They're only trying to put it in proper perspective, which is, I mean, the Americans historically have always inflated their role to such an extent. And by the way, I should say it's not just inflation, it's also serious falsification. Because if you read the critical historians, people in the tradition of the Beards, of William Appleman Williams, more recently Andrew Bacevich, and so on, they have always emphasized, Sidney Lenz is another guy, they have always emphasized that the United States, in both World Wars, the United States entered late. The reason the United States entered late is because it was trying to make sure that it benefited economically from both wars. The story you cited at the beginning, where you got these people saying, we're going to test our weapons in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. When the United States has a long history of benefiting economically from war. If you plot US GDP growth rates since the middle of the 19th century till today, you will see two big peaks. Guess what they are? They are the two world wars. It's no surprise that the United States economy is addicted to war. War spending both within the United States and outside the United States, thanks to NATO, thanks to the interoperability requirements that require NATO allies to buy a substantial amount of US weapons, etc., the US has always benefited from war. So first of all, the US in a calculated way enters the war precisely when it will benefit maximally. Secondly, as you rightly pointed out, like the United States suffered a few 100,000 casualties, maybe a couple of 100,000. The Soviet Union lost nearly 30 million lives. China lost nearly 20 million lives. In fact, this group that I run, the International Manifesto Group, we are going to do a webinar on this matter of victory over Japan. And we describe the webinar and we begin by saying that it is often said that the victors of any war write its history, but that does not seem to apply to the Second World War, because the two sets of victors are not the ones that are universally acknowledged in the West. The West keeps congratulating itself, even though such large parts of the West, either they were outright fascists themselves, like Germany and its allies in Europe, or Vichy France, or what have you, and the various neutral countries of Northern Europe. I mean, so you have this completely compromised record, which is then praised to the skies. Meanwhile, the Soviet record is erased. The Chinese communist record is erased. So much so that in recent commemorations of victory in the Second World War, the leader of Russia has not been invited. I mean, it is such a sacrilege of something as simple and as critically important as historical memory that that Putin was not invited to these recent celebrations. It is shocking.
Switching gears a bit, and I didn't mention this at the top, but Europe just made war with Iran more likely. France, this is from Responsible Statecraft. France, Germany, and the UK's push to reimpose UN sanctions on Tehran is just the first step. They're going to launch a 30-day process that will likely culminate in the full reinstatement of all UN sanctions lifted under the 2015 nuclear deal. The move will carry 4 major consequences, and they list what these consequences are. I'll let you respond to that, and we'll figure out how we want to unpack the rest of that. It's surprising in some regards when you think back to the Obama administration and the JCPOA and where Europe was in supporting the JCPOA, when Trump withdrew from it, it was Europe that held steadfast in trying to bring the parties back together. And now it seems, just, I guess, from a historical perspective, overnight that they're flipping the script.
Yes, and I think this is again this also in a certain sense actually does come back to the Tianjin summit in the following way. One of the thoughts that keeps recurring as I read the coverage of the Tianjin summit and more generally read the news over the last few days is that the picture that we see is that in Tianjin, there is a sort of there is the meeting, or there is the creation of a sort of an ever widening ocean of relative tranquility. This is, of countries coming together in order to cooperate, countries coming together in order to promote development, countries coming together in order to promote peace. Countries coming together in order to address climate change, for crying out loud. Since over the last 3 or 4 years, nobody has said anything about climate change, even as the climate gets worse year by year. The number of natural disasters related to climate grows, including in the United States. We can come back to that, and so on. So on the one hand, you have this widening ocean of tranquility, and on the other hand, you have this kind of a storming other side of the world, so to speak, composed of the West. And the storms, and so that's one contrast. The second thing I want to say, which is directly connected with this, is that, when people talk about the rise of China and the BRICS and the world majority and the global South and all of these things, they usually attribute it to the proactive efforts that are being made by these countries to pursue their own development. And of course, this is very important, and it is definitely one part of a larger picture. But what's the other part? It is the decline of the West. Now, here I'm now coming to this issue of Europe and Iran and so on. So the West is declining economically. It has adopted an economic system, namely late monopoly, financialized capitalism, unproductive, speculative, predatory capitalism, which has led to a massive increase in inequality of income and wealth in these countries. This has created deep-rooted social divisions, which are then the foundation on which political polarization rests. And so the West is suffering from all of this complex combination of crises. And in this context, you see, when lots of people have asked why, even though Donald Trump is willing to stop the war in Ukraine through one means or another, the Europeans have suddenly acquired a new zest for it. Why is this happening? I've thought about it a lot, and the suicidal behavior of the Europeans, the fact that Germany has... Sorry.
I've been asking that question just about every show.
Exactly. Why are they doing this? Germany has apparently lost 10% of its manufacturing capacity. Like, wow. This is supposed to be this is a country that has been devoted to its productive economy for a long time, and now suddenly it's willing to sacrifice its manufacturing economy. Like, you thought, the gods of manufacturing must be spinning in their graves or whatever. I guess gods don't go to graves, but you get my point. Yeah. They must be extremely angry anyway, sitting up there in heaven. So why is this? And I believe that you see the level. So, and the United States and the West are at just two different stages of this process. In the United States, the process of this pervasive crisis that I just mentioned, economic, social, political, etc., has gone so far that they have had to elect somebody like Trump, who must at least appear to abandon war because it's not popular. In Europe, they are at a slightly earlier phase of their development. They are still at the Biden phase, where in order to retain power, you need to be at war, because that then enables you to silence your opposition. It enables you to, take all sorts of extraordinary measures and continue to pursue a neoliberal form of have a neoliberal economy in which you still don't give anything to the workers. If you're going to spend more money, you're not going to spend it on social security or better healthcare systems or better schooling systems. No, you're going to spend it on more weapons. Mr. Merz is willing to sacrifice Germany's long-standing commitment to a balanced budget precisely in order that Germany may buy more weapons, not that Germany may add to its once very fine welfare state or anything like that. So to me, this is the key to understanding the European stance, European warlike stance.
Is that the growth of neoliberalism in Europe? Is it, to put it in a very simplistic manner, that what we're looking at it with, and I keep going back to blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline and Schultz just standing there like a puppet as Joe Biden talked about, no, we're not going to let that happen.
Yes,
we're not going to let
yes.
that. So
I remember that clip, yes.
So so again, to put it in very simplistic terms, is this the introduction of neoliberalism into European economics and politics?
Yeah, so a lot of people may feel a little bit puzzled by my use of the term neoliberalism, but I think it's important to clarify that it has always been misunderstood. And in my book, Capitalism, Coronavirus and War, I discuss this in considerable detail. And by the way, everybody can download it for free if they want. But here's the thing. Neoliberalism is generally, it is advertised as, what it says on the tin is it's about free markets and free trade. But it doesn't do what it says on the tin. What it's really about is preserving the power of big monopoly corporations, which today are increasingly financialized, speculative, predatory, and unproductive corporations, enjoying vast amounts of rentier incomes. Now, the Europe, particularly its leading economy, Germany, has kind of resisted this to some extent, but I think particularly, certainly during the 80s, but after unification in the 1990s, it seems to have gone more or less headlong into this. So they are into preserving the power of their big corporations. And this is come to a point where it has become so unbearable at a popular level that there has been a huge popular backlash against this, including against the Ukraine war and all that. But so far, this has not affected, so far at least, this popular backlash has been mobilized by the right, not by progressive forces. Now, this is beginning to change. In Germany, as Die Linke did well last time. There is Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht. In Britain now, we have a new political party being formed by Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana. We have in France, of course, you have the France Insoumise. All of these forces are there. Maybe they will, who knows how they will do. But at the moment, the opposition is being monopolized by a right which is just as neoliberal. They will be like Trump. Trump has won votes by pretending to be against some of the worst things that are happening, against wars and so on. But in reality, he is doing everything to preserve the power of the same big corporations. So if the Nigel Farages of this world or the Alternative für Deutschland, etc., if such forces come to power, this is not going to change anything. So, and very briefly, I might say one other thing, which is that, neoliberalism has never been this idea of free markets, free trade has never been an accurate description of what's going on. So neoliberalism has shifted shape nearly every decade. So you had the classic free market, free trade neoliberalism of Reagan Reagan and Thatcher. Then you got neoliberalism in the guise of globalization in the 1990s. Then you got neoliberalism in the guise of US empire in the 2000s. Then you got austerity in the 2010s. And now I would say that we are in between two versions. One is a kind of Bidenite neoliberalism in which basically what I call pseudo-civic neoliberalism, in which the state, under the guise of providing things for the people, whether it is more weapons, which is for the security of people, or vaccines or what have you, essentially pay big corporations vast quantities of super profit money in order to produce things that are provided to the public for relatively cheap or free or what have you. But in the end, the public pays for it with their taxes anyway. And the other alternative is the Trump, Farage, Alternative für Deutschland, etc. type far-right forces. So both of them are neoliberal forces because both of them are equally committed to preserving the power of the big corporations.
I wanted to quickly get your take on, or your sense of, the appearance of Prime Minister Modi at the SCO, because there was a piece here, I can't remember where I got it. Among the highlights of this year's summit was Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's attendance, his first visit to China since the deadly border clashes between the two sides in 2020. And some of the other descriptions were that how Modi, Xi, Erdogan, and Putin were seen together, smiling, laughing, joking, getting along quite well. Did Modi's attendance this year send any signals to you?
I mean, I think Modi has always attended SCO summits, so I mean, this year is no different. But of course, this year's visit takes place in the context not only of being the first visit to China since those clashes in 2020, but also, of course, it comes hot on the heels of Trump's imposition of 50% tariffs on India, as also, of course, on Brazil, which is the highest that he has imposed on any country. Not even China has merited that treatment. My own understanding of this is that Trump really, I mean, look, Trump has imposed these tariffs on India in a kind of act of sort of malign insouciance. He doesn't care about India, because the India is not a hugely externalized economy. I mean, yes, India is more dependent on trade with the US than the US is on India, etc. So, in a certain sense, Trump thinks that he can get India to do this, that, or the other, stop buying Russian oil, whatever it is. He's just miffed. I'm not even sure that he really needs or wants necessarily India to stop buying Russian oil, but because he demanded it and then India refused it, then now he's miffed and he has imposed these tariffs on India. So that's one part of the story. And I have no doubt that since he has left India with nothing to lose, Modi is using the opportunity to appear as though he were really independent. And with Modi, it's always about appearances. Okay. Please, I find that too many people, too many commentators regard Modi as just another national leader. You people forget that he comes from a party that is avowedly pro-fascist, let me at least put it that way. He himself displays many of the characteristics of fascism. To be a Muslim in India today is very close to what it was like to be a Jew in Germany in the 1930s, or for that matter, being a black person through much of American history in the American South. So, this is the kind of situation Modi has created. So do not, and by the way, he has made a mess of the economy in a variety of different ways. India's growth figures are heavily cooked and should not be taken so seriously. Basically, they take the growth statistics for a very narrow section of the big corporate economy, which is doing very well. And they impute it to the rest of the Indian economy, which is doing extremely badly. leave that aside. But let me just say, for Modi, it's always about appearances. So he has, of course, done everything possible to exploit appearances. But let's just lift that little blanket of a veil of appearances and look just a little bit beneath it. Where else did Modi go and not go? Modi is not attending the 80th anniversary celebrations of the victory over Japan in Beijing. Not only that, and by the way, over 2 million Indians also fought in order to achieve victory against Japan. And Modi is not there. And Modi is not saying that the sacrifices of these people must also be celebrated. Indeed, there is hardly any celebration of these forces in India. So that's one point I want to make. Secondly, not only is Modi not attending the celebrations of victory over Japan, which, by the way, is being reported as an unrepentant Japan in many ways, he visited Japan just before going to Tianjin, where he once again repeated all the rhetoric about how India is a democracy against the autocracies that are obviously implicitly, he didn't say that, but implicitly implying that the autocracies are meeting in Tianjin, and here I'm along with Japan, we are democracies and we have many things in common, and we want to create peace in the Indo-Pacific, using this precise expression which the United States has used in order to NATOize the security situation in the Pacific region. So, and of course, the other, and by the way, I'm not personally clear whether it is Modi who declined to go to the celebrations or that China pointedly did not invite him, because more recently, despite the attempts to create this impression that India is pursuing better relations with China, and in the process, Wang Yi, the external affairs minister of China, came to India, and they had some good discussions, and they have made some good measures, like they released, increase the possibilities of travel, and so on and so forth between India and China. But no sooner was Wang Yi back in Beijing than India issued some kind of clarification on its one China policy, which, of course, annoyed Beijing a great deal, as it would, because this is the one most important red line for China. So in all of these ways, I have no doubt that India stands ready for a clear signal from Washington that Washington is willing to make amends with India, because I really, the whole of India's capitalist class, or at least the top level of India's capitalist class, is still too invested in its relationship with the West.
I want to shift the conversation to some American domestic issues and get your take on this. As an economist, Trump orders have stripped nearly 500,000 federal workers of union rights. The president, who has targeted collective bargaining contracts for nearly 1 million government employees, has said their functions touch on national security. A couple of things. He understands very clearly marketing, and he understands the power of language. So when he throws out national security, he thinks that gives him carte blanche to just run amok and he can do whatever he wants to do in the name of national security. First of all, he decimates the federal workforce and then attacks their ability to collectively bargain. But there's some unions, though, unions that backed him during his candidacy, so far anyway, have gone unscathed, while others now find themselves no longer able to collectively bargain. Your thoughts?
Yeah, this is just absolutely, this is really fascinating. So just some quick thoughts. Number one, the constitution of any capitalist country, when it defines security, whose security is it defining? Yeah. most of us think that it is the security of ordinary citizens of that country. But in reality, security is always defined in such a way that as so as to preserve the rule of the ruling classes, and by which I also mean, genders, races, etc. I mean, this is a generic term, but the ruling classes. And so therefore, every bourgeois constitution is riddled through with possibilities of violating that very constitution or subverting that very constitution in extraordinary circumstances, so that exactly. So and what's surprising, is the extent to which national security, and it would be very interesting to make a list of all the legislation that Trump has invoked. Of course, national security is the most common, but he's also been very good at picking out laws that have been forgotten for centuries and then, applying them. It would be really interesting to make a list of those laws that he has invoked and see what is the pattern that you see there. So that's one thing. The second thing is, yes, it's really interesting that, he's not going after the unions that supported him. He's going after the unions that did not. This is not very different from the fact that, what is it? He's targeting, of course, places like Washington, D.C. Is it not true that Washington, D.C. was the only jurisdiction in the United States in the 2024 election where Trump did not increase his vote? I remember that from a FT piece that came out soon after the election. When so like in every state and jurisdiction, he increased his vote. But for Washington, D.C., so it's not surprising that, these federal troops are marching through the streets of Washington. Of course, it's also the case that at the end of the day, Trump is a racist bigot. He is targeting Washington, D.C. as a historic place where, African Americans have been in large numbers. The next city he's talking about targeting is Chicago, which is again well known for being a city with a very large African American population. So in all of these ways, I think that he is definitely playing electoral politics in a sense.
And a black mayor.
Yes.
Black mayor in D.C., female. Black mayor in Chicago. Black mayor, female in Los Angeles. He's also talking about Oakland. Black female mayor in Oakland.
And not to forget the black heads of the National Labor Relations Board who was targeted, and the case is going to go before the Supreme Court. And of course, the case of Lisa Cook, who is one of the very, very few black governors of the Federal Reserve Board. So yes, of course, and he is playing to his white gallery.
Only black female, I know that. I don't know how many black males there have been, but I know she's the first and only African American female. So, from a union perspective, does this send any signal to you relative to attacking unions?
Well, I mean, the fact is that he has, this goes back to, if you remember, on Liberation Day, on April the 2nd, he had a union leader or union worker, whatever, come and praise his tariffs and so on. I mean, the thing is that both, this is a very interesting phenomenon, not only in the United States, but also in some of these other countries of the West that we have been discussing, what is happening in the context of the pervasive crisis that we have talked about. And that is that because the working class, because they have essentially over 4.5 decades of neoliberalism simply destroyed left forces, and they continue to destroy them. So somebody like Jeremy Corbyn comes along and becomes completely fortuitously becomes the leader of the Labour Party back in whatever it was, 2016-17. And what does the establishment do? They go hammer and tongs at him. throwing everything, discrediting his economic policies, blah, blah. And then if anything else doesn't work, of course, he's anti-Semitic. Because invariably, such a progressive leader will be supportive of the Palestinian cause. And therefore, invariably, you can always call him an anti-Semite because he's taking an anti-Zionist position. So anyway, so because of this overdrive of anti-socialist, anti-left behavior, what you've got is these very people have, the Bidens of this world have created the circumstances in which the only forces that can emerge are the Trumps of this world, or the Farages of this world, or the AFDs of this world, and so on. So, and these people have made gains by taking over part of the working class, so that today, in Boris Johnson's time, the Conservative Party had become a substantially working class party. Under Trump, the Republican Party has become a more substantially working class party than it ever had been before. Similarly, in the case of these other things. So really, we are looking at a battle over the working class. And yes, so he is basically saying to the whole working class, you do like these guys who supported me, or else you're going to get it. And the only way out of this is for the working class to realize that people like Trump have absolutely no intention of bettering their condition, and to create their own political forces that are not dividing the working class by gender, by race, by religion, by any other ethnicity, etc., etc. And that's the only way to move forward.
And as we get out, and you mentioned the earlier support of the unions, I remember Sean Fain, the president of the UAW, in endorsing Joe Biden. It was around the 11th of January. He then came out and the same day in another speech said, but the rank and file will vote for Trump. And I found that's
incredible.
I found that to be very, very surprising. Dr. Radhika Desai, as always, thank you so much for your time today. And I always look forward to these conversations, and you never disappoint.
I think our conversations always go in really interesting directions, Wilmer. So thanks very much for having me.
It's my pleasure. Thank you. Look forward to having you back.
Great. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Folks, thank you all so much for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. New episode tomorrow. I'm hoping and working on, I don't want to put him on blast, but I'm hoping that KJ No will join us tomorrow, and really looking forward to that conversation. Again, as we look at the commemoration of the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. Please follow and subscribe, leave a review, share the show, follow us on social media. All the links are below in the show description. And remember that this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge, because talk without analysis is just chatter, and we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. See y'all tomorrow. Have the blessed remainder of your day. I am Dr. Wilmer Leon. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.